Hello, and welcome to this low-budget TED Talk on the hot topic of feminism. So what is feminism? Feminism is the belief in the social, economic and political equality of the sexes. It's a mostly Western concept which predominantly has its roots in the suffrage movement in the 1800s. Before we get started, we need to understand that feminism does not equal female supremacy. Rather, it is the equality between the sexes. The feminist movement is what helps to inform feminist literary criticism and how females are represented in texts. To understand feminist literary criticism, we have to have a deep knowledge of the history of feminism. The feminist movement is generally split up into three waves: the first, second, and the third wave. A brief overview of these waves is: the first wave was for suffrage or women's voting rights, the second wave was for social equality between genders, and the third was more inclusive of all women of all races identifying gender or sexual orientation and the concept of the gender spectrum. The oppression of the female gender has been quite common in most civilizations since the beginning of history, being ingrained into the culture of societies. Ancient societies such as ancient Greece and Rome denied women voting, academic schooling, landowning rights, and even rights to own expensive goods. In response to being asked about women gaining ownership of expensive goods, the philosopher Cato replied, "If they are victorious now, what will they attempt? As soon as they begin to be your equals, they will have become your superiors." Throughout history, Western societies have tended to place the value of a woman solely on their reproductive and domestic capabilities. However, a definite shift was observed in the 18th century, with writers such as Mary Wollstonecraft publishing works such as A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. This was a text calling for gender equality and a fair education system that grants all people equal opportunity regardless of sex. It argued that social norms prevented women from ever learning to achieve anything outside the domestic home. This is considered a trailblazing work for feminism, which would inspire women throughout the next 100 years. Another notable feminist writer was Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote the work The Second Sex in 1949. This work highlights the marginalisation or othering of women in Western society, due to men creating a sort of mystery around the female existence. She explores the notion that existence precedes essence. In other words, at conception, people are not defined as female or male, but rather they grow and become female or male as they develop. She also emphasises that women are able to transcend immanence by their own choice. The notion of choice for a woman is essential in de Beauvoir's works, which is also an important element of libertarian feminism. In 1867, the London Society for Women's Suffrage was formed, which was an organisation that campaigned for women's votes and rights. The Married Women's Property Act, made in 1870, gave married women the right to own property, which was the first real political step for the feminist movement. By this time, first wave feminism was in full swing, campaigning for women's voting rights around the world. Gradually, more and more Western societies granted women the right to vote, starting in New Zealand in 1893, with South Australia being the first Australian colony to grant women voting rights. Full voting rights for all Australian women came in 1902, after Australia had federated. World War I and II were also an opportunity for feminism to be demonstrated. With the men away fighting the war, women blurred the boundaries of a typical gender role, working laborious jobs and demonstrating masculine capabilities, enforcing the growing idea that women were just as capable as men, physically and intellectually. However, it ultimately inspired no great social change, as the status quo returned to normality when the men returned from war. But it did manage to inspire the belief of women's capability and breaking down of gender roles. In the post-World War II world, Western societies saw the social norms of the breadwinner, being the father, and stay-at-home mum more heavily enforced. Tension began to rise as women desired to break free of these gender roles, culminating in the rise of second-wave feminism in the early 1960s. This wave was further spurred on by the rising influence of minorities in society due to the impact of anti-war protests. This wave concerned itself more with gender equality in a social sense rather than political, fighting for equal pay, equal opportunity and reproductive rights, and against restrictive gender roles. This wave was especially influential in inspiring libertarian feminism, which is what I will be discussing in more depth. Personal autonomy is strongly emphasised in this wave of feminism. Personal autonomy is the ability to control one's own decisions, actions and life without the interference of coercive outside forces. This then led to third wave feminism in the early 1990s, a wave which was especially inspired by postmodern ideas. This movement blurred the boundaries between what defines male and female and masculine and feminine. It developed the concept of separation from masculine from male and from feminine from female, and the belief that gender is a spectrum rather than two definites. Imagine it this way. You have metal music and you have pop music. You may really like metal music, but like some aspects of pop music. You may really like pop music, but like some aspects of metal music. You can be anywhere in between. You could be right in the middle. You do not have to be definite. It emphasised that both men and women are able to display masculine and feminine traits, and that no one is truly entirely masculine or entirely feminine. And now we delve further. Libertarian feminism is the belief that all women deserve and have the right to freedom, whether that be from the government or other hegemonic power structures, or from socially constructed gender roles and stereotypes. Liberal feminists place emphasised value on the personal autonomy of women, and that governments and society do not recognise this autonomy. Liberal feminists also argue that society holds the belief that women are inherently less capable, both intellectually and physically, than men, and heavily criticise this notion that society holds. They strongly believe that women can lead the life that they wish to lead. On a deeper level, cultural libertarian feminism is the belief that women's personal autonomy is oppressed by cultural norms and standards developed through tradition. It is the belief that the culture in question is inherently patriarchal due to centuries of patriarchy being ingrained into the culture. Cultural libertarian feminists associate with radical feminists in the belief that society must be restructured in order to remedy the patriarchal oppression women face. To summarise, cultural libertarian feminists hold the belief that women must break the patriarchal norms inherited generationally in a culture to gain personal autonomy. To apply a cultural libertarian feminist reading practice, one must apply the values and beliefs of the practice to the text and determine to what extent the text demonstrates these values or the antithesis of these values, which is the patriarchy or male supremacy. When applied, it helps to identify how women are oppressed in the patriarchal culture of the text, or how female characters resist or challenge this culture. It places a large focus on the female experience with the struggles against the patriarchal culture. This reading practice allows the reader to identify the inequalities between male and female political, economic, or social autonomy. By applying this practice to the novel Drylands, we see the author, Thea Astley, challenging the patriarchal culture of rural Australia. Astley demonstrates characters that are initially oppressed by the rural Australian culture and consequently their husbands, but go on to resist this oppression and gain personal autonomy. Throughout this chapter, there are many instances where female characters are demonstrated to lack control and autonomy over their decisions. To first foreshadow what is to come in the chapter, a feminist analysis of the language employed demonstrates the patriarchal views of rural Australia. The first instance is when a female protagonist, Evie, exclaims, "Uh-oh, booed," in response to being made a fool. This demonstrates how even strong females such as Evie make the association between femininity and stupidity, highlighting the libertarian feminist belief that society views women as less intellectually capable. Another indication of the patriarchal nature of rural Australian culture is presented when Evie first arrives in Drylands. She describes the setting as a world of gum trees, bark stripping, dangling, their bony limbs rejecting grace, crowded arrogant as beggars in their rags. The phallic imagery of gum trees and their arrogance, coupled with Evie being situated beneath them, give a clear image of the patriarchal oppression present in this culture and how the males believe they control the town and stand over women. Astley shows this to be confronting and constrictive to women. As Evie recalls, she found herself wildly running, gasping and panting in unidentifiable terror. This recount highlights how the oppression of women constricts them socially, intellectually and emotionally, forcing them into either submission or panic. An understanding of this culture helps the reader to appreciate the women's struggle for personal autonomy in this society. After taking the sexist culture of rural Australia into account, a cultural libertarian feminist lens gives the reader a deep appreciation for the struggles that women face in gaining personal autonomy. The oppression of the women is clearly highlighted when Lanny, a student of Evie's, states, "My old man didn't want me to come. Thought it might give me ideas. He seems to think we're trying to be something we haven't any right to be." Astley highlights here that in the rural Australian culture, women are believed to be undeserving of an education that enables them to freely express themselves and possess personal autonomy, which warrants in itself an angered response from libertarian feminists, as this woman is being denied the right to her own education. This idea that women are believed to be inherently less intellectual than men is further enforced when Rose's husband says to her, "He always was slow to get the message." Astley creates a great irony in this line, as the husband believes his wife to be a stupid or slow woman, when in fact his incorrect diction and syntax would prove that he is by far the less educated and less intelligent of the two, challenging this belief that women are less intellectual. This analysis proves to the reader how in this rural Australian culture, women are deemed to be far less intellectually capable than men. However, the reality is that the women seek a grounded education that the patriarchal culture of the town attempts to remove. This notion is challenged under libertarian feminist analysis, as they believe that gender does not define a lack of intellectuality. A lack of personal autonomy is also demonstrated in how the wives are instructed to return home against their will, for the sole reason that their husband said so. The husbands burst into the creative writing session demanding they need the wives, with brutish and idiotic statements, and that their wives return home to help out around the house with domestic issues. However, they are then confronted by the resisting Evie, who says that they are needed later in the day. Evie's clear and strong position that the women shall not leave is a first rising against the patriarchal control over the women's autonomy that the husbands have, which inspires other characters to do so too. Despite cultural norms suggesting that the wives must return home at their husband's whim, Roe and Wynne resist the demands of their husband and defy their orders, stating, "I'm not coming," with repeated firmness, a first real show of their newfound personal autonomy. But this is not taken well. Roe is then violently beaten, but held her position and remained in the class. A cultural libertarian feminist reading first acknowledges the control of the patriarchy and men over the woman in this small town, which represents rural Australian culture, but secondly celebrates Roe for her heroic defiance and personal autonomy. The physical abuse is also symbolic of what cultural libertarian feminists believe is required to rid society of patriarchal oppression. The beating represents how, although it may be a painful road to healing, radical changes and alterations must be made to society in order to heal it. Astley challenges the patriarchal culture of rural Australia in Roe's final triumph when she escapes from her abusive husband and thus the patriarchy of Drylands, to begin a new life outside of the town with her children. This is a final show of Roe's newfound autonomy, which a libertarian feminist reading celebrates and praises as an example of a woman gaining personal autonomy from a society with patriarchy deeply ingrained into its culture. Another notable instance of women lacking self-autonomy and control over their person is the sexual assault of Evie by the Glaswegian man. Evie first meets this man on the train to Drylands, where he begins to make sexual advances on her. Whilst she is sleeping, the man attempts to take advantage of her, stroking her leg without her consent. After awaking, Evie is highly aware of what the man has attempted to do and is disgusted. However, she is unable to say or do anything in response to his advances, as she is aware that in rural Australian society there will be nothing done in response to this man's actions, and they will regard her claims as inconsequential and unnoteworthy. On the train, she was wanting to shout at him, name him a creep, a sleaze, but turning instead to watch the stragglers on the platform. This inability to speak out shows how rural Australian society rejects the notion that women deserve respect and a fundamental right to control their own body and actions, and that women are conditioned to believe that their troubles are unremarkable. Feminist readers are also disgusted at the abuse of power by the man, and how it seems he holds the belief that he may do whatever he wants with Evie's body. After this initial instance on the train, the man continues to persist with Evie, despite her objections. He continues to follow her around Drylands, and refuses to let her go. She continues to tell him, "No, go away," yet he blatantly refuses to follow her clear intent. His refusal to listen to Evie demonstrates how in Australian society, women possess little autonomy over their body and choices, as men continue to overpower and disregard female choice and autonomy. A libertarian feminist reading would greatly anger readers, as they note this lack of autonomy, which is a key value that liberal feminists fight for. So that is it for our low-budget TED Talk on cultural libertarian feminism. Hope you enjoy.